Hello, and congratulations on making it to week 5 of the course. As a gift to you, there will be only one lecture for this week. It'll be on possible worlds, the metaphysics of possible worlds, and we'll only cover two accounts of possible worlds. So your reading was the Stanford Encyclopedia entry by Christopher Menzel. He covers three accounts, but I'm really only going to cover Lewis's account and an abstractionist. So read what you can from that, but you don't necessarily have to read all the way to the end. Okay, so first we need to sort of set up the history of why we're even talking about the metaphysics of possible worlds. Really only kind of picked up in the latter half of the 20th century, because until that point we really hadn't logically worked out a rigorous um, logic of what we call modality, possibility, and necessity. Um, so we have been talking about counterfactuals in this course. Um, Counterfactuals are statements about not how the world is, but how the world could be. So when we talk about causation, right, in Lewis's counterfactual account of causation, and he says the electrical short causes the fire because if the short hadn't happened, the fire wouldn't have happened, right? And that's his account of causation. He's talking about a possible state of affairs, not the actual one. In the actual world, the fire did happen, right? So the counterfactual situation is about a situation that's similar to the actual world, but in which one or more of the facts has changed. So for these to be useful, right, and for example, our analysis of causation, we would need some reason to think that statements like that can be true or false, right, that they're truth apt. But since they don't describe the actual world, right, what would it make it true that if the short hadn't happened, the fire wouldn't have happened, right? Because as a matter of fact, the short did happen. So isn't that just false, right? Or actually, strictly speaking, it's trivially true, right? Because it's a conditional if then, and the antecedent is false, right? The short didn't happen is false because the short did happen. So all the counterfactuals would come out true, right? But also like lots of counterfactuals we don't want, like if pigs could fly, the fire wouldn't have happened. And we don't want to say that pigs flying is the cause of the fire. So we need a semantics that's not just concerned with the actual facts in the actual world for determining the truth values of counterfactual statements. We need a rigorous way to talk about things that didn't happen but could have and make sense of how those can be true or false. So to understand how modal logic works, we're going to step a little bit back and talk about just regular quantificational logic. So logical systems have two parts, a syntax and a semantics. The syntax tells you it's the grammar. It tells you what counts as a well-formed statement. So P and Q is a well-formed statement in sentential logic, and PQ is not, right? It's just ungrammatical. Um, Now, the semantics tells you that if you've got a well-formed statement, it'll tell you whether it's true or false. And the semantics for basic quantificational logic work by positing a domain of objects, and then the truth or falsity of a statement will depend on whether it matches what's going on in that domain. Now, the domain can be sort of chosen arbitrarily. Um, for the purposes of science, it's the entire universe, but of a logical problem, we could say the objects in this room, the coins in my pocket, whatever you like. But you do have to stipulate what domain you're talking about. So here's a toy example talking about some pets. The pets that this person named John owns, right? Their domain is the pets owned by John, and John owns two dogs. So in that domain, right, there are two dogs. Okay, now we can make statements about the objects in that domain, and we can determine whether it's true or false. So one statement would be all of John's pets are mammals. Is this true? Well, let's check it out. Let's look in the domain. There are two dogs in there, right? Each dog is a mammal, and so we'll conclude, yes, that statement is true. So, but now what do we do with modal claims, right? So you could say necessarily all of John's pets are mammals. That's a claim about necessity. That's a modal claim. Now, intuitively, this is false, right? There's no necessity about John owning a dog. He could tomorrow go buy a fish, right? But there's nothing about semantics for regular quantificational logic can make that true, right? We've only got dogs in the domain. There's no fish in the domain. So what do? We need a different sort of semantics, right? And a different, some more apparatus for our logical system, so that we can talk about not only the pets that John does own, but the pets that he could own, right? So this is done. The semantics for logic talks about, right? So the first of all, that what is added in a modal logic are quantifiers necessarily and possibly. So necessarily says, right, it has to be the case everywhere at all times. It can never be otherwise. Impossibly means this could happen, right? And the way they flesh that out in the semantics is using the concept of a possible world. And they're not really committed to what that actually is metaphysically. We'll talk about the metaphysics later. So this is just a tool, right, for working this out. So we've got our quantifiers. The little box is necessity, and the little diamond is possibility, right? And then if you're using those quantifiers, now we're not just talking about the actual world, but we're talking about a bunch of different possible worlds. The domain now includes all these different possible worlds. Each possible world has its own set of facts about, for example, what pets John has, right? So maybe there's a possible world where John has a fish, maybe there's a possible world where John has no pets, and so on, right? So if we want to say necessarily all of John's pets are mammals, right? We'd have to look at all the possible worlds. And if it turns out that in every possible world, all of John's pets are mammals, then it's true. The possible world where John has a fish, then that's false. That necessity claim comes out false. Um, so necessity claims are only true if they're true at every possible world. Now, for the purpose of logic problems, you can sort of like stipulate what his pets are at every possible world. So, necessarily all John's circles are round. That's going to come out true, right? Because the nature of circles. Possibly all of John's pets are mammals. That'll turn out true as long as there's one world where, uh, John has a pet that's a mammal, right? And the way this up there is, right? In the actual world, he owns two mammals. That possibility claim is true. So again, for now, we're just stipulating what's in each possible world, what the facts are. Um, but of course, we're going to apply this to science. We'd like to figure out some way to figure out how these possibility claims are true, without us just deciding. And Lewis does this, right? He tried to set up truth conditions with his nearness relation among worlds, right? So the idea is a, a counterfactual is true, right? If it's basically true at the nearest possible world, right? And the nearest possible world is the world where the fewest number of facts have changed, right? So a world where everything's the same except the electrical short didn't happen. That's the world we want to look at, right? That's the nearest possible world. And if in that world where the short didn't happen, the fire didn't happen, then we say that counterfactual is true, right? Okay, so far we've been setting up a logic and semantics for modal claims, um, and see how this construct, this possible worlds construct, is very useful if you want to flesh out a logic for possibility and necessity. Um, but we would like to use them to ground the truth of counterfactuals. They're going to be used in our account of causation and in our scientific theories, right? So we do kind of wonder about what they actually are, right? Because again, if their job is to make these sentences true, we've been operating with a sort of correspondence theory of truth that says, well, something has to exist to make the thing true. Right? So if I say my shirt is brown, that is made true by an actual shirt that exists that is actually brown, right? So, if I say the tree is green, that's made true by the tree I'm talking about and whether it's actually green. But if I want to say this tree could have been blue, well, again, the semantics of modal logic says it'll be true if there's a possible world where the tree is blue, but is there really a possible world where the tree is blue? Or, again, is this just sort of a construct, a manner of speaking? Well, the former thing seems pretty weird to say, oh, yeah, there's a blue tree. It's just in a different world, but yeah, it sure exists, right? Um, but the saying it's just a manner of speaking doesn't really seem to do the job that the truth maker is supposed to do, namely exist, right? The one thing that truth makers are supposed to, that's all they need to do is exist, right? All my shirt has to do to make my shirt is brown true. So what do we do about that? Well, one approach, and this is David Lewis's approach, is to say, yes, the possible worlds do exist. That blue tree does exist in another world, right? Possible worlds are just like the actual world, and there is nothing special about the actual world. It is not more real than the possible worlds. They're not less real than our world. We just happen to live in this one. That's why we call it the actual world. Nothing special about it. Doesn't exist any more or less than the possible world, right? Now, these possible worlds are spatio-temporally and causally isolated from each other. So they are not, if you've heard of the many worlds account of quantum mechanics, that's a different sort of thing because those worlds are causally related in some way, right? Um, kind of usually I think in one direction. There's kind of these splits in the possible worlds in that theory, but that they are grounded. There's a causal relation that started this split. This is something totally different. David Lewis is talking about they're just completely spatiotemporal, causally isolated from our world, right? So you can't travel there, can't communicate with them, you can never have any direct knowledge that they exist, right? But Lewis claims they do exist. Why in the world would he claim that they exist? He says, well, it makes for the best theory, right? It's a simple, straightforward way of making sense of why these counterfactual sentences can be true and false, right? Sentences like, if I'd married Cynthia, everything would be okay, or if the electrical short hadn't happened, the fire wouldn't have started, right? We need an account. We need to make those sentences true or false. We need an account of it. And he seems like, well, if the possible worlds exist, it sure does tie it all up in a neat little package, right? And going back to Quine, if you recall, Quine said something similar. He said, look, everything's up for grabs, right? If if we need to give up a law of logic to make our best theories work and hang together, then we do that, right? Our kind of what we're doing is looking for a holistic theory that makes the whole world and science and everything hang together. And if we have to give up on some of our dearest intuitions, right, then I guess we have to do that. And if one of our dearest intuitions is that the world is the only real world, then maybe we have to give up on it. Okay, so that's the broad outlines, right, of the account. It's fairly simple and straightforward. That's kind of the beauty of it, and that's the appeal of it, and that's why he thinks it's true. Um, there are some tricky bits that he works out, and he works them out very cleverly. So one thing is like, how do I deal with a sentence that mentions me? If I say I could have married Agatha, um, that means there's a possible world out there where I married Agatha. But if that's literally true, then it seems like I both did and did not marry Agatha, and that is contradictory, right? Um, so we don't want contradictions. Lewis doesn't like contradictions. Uh, so he gets around that by denying that I actually exist in other possible worlds. Instead, my counterpart exists. So what's my counterpart? Counterpart is just like me, right? There may be worlds where it's qualitatively identical to me, right? Um, there may be other worlds where it's slightly different, right? So if I want to talk about I could have had black hair, then maybe there's a possible world where my counterpart has black hair, but is otherwise, identical to me, right? And it can, there could be possible worlds where my counterpart has black hair and also works out a lot and is very big and also had surgery to have his legs lengthened and also has tattoos, right? So my counterpart can get different, right? Um, it's an interesting question, how different, right? We'll talk about it a little later. Is there a possible world where my counterpart is a dog, right? Or am I essentially human and it's therefore impossible to make counterparts are dogs? That'll a detail we don't need to flesh out here, but it's interesting. But at any rate, my counterpart is not numerically identical to me, so there is no contradiction involved in saying I could have married Agatha, right? All I'm saying is there's a counterpart of me that married Agatha, right? But it's not me. So the other advantage of counterparts, which I just hinted at, um, well, it'll come in a second, is Lewis. It allows Lewis to treat predicates as not restricted to a given world. Again, predicates are things like is green, right? Is a pig, right? All those capital letters in our logic language. So the extension of the predicate is green in this modal logic is not just green things in our world, but also all the green things in all the possible worlds, right? The extension of green is just every green thing in every possible world. Now, without counterpart theory, right, we would again run into contradictions, right? Because if my hair is black in another possible world, then my hair is both blonde and black. But no, it's my counterpart's hair is black, right? Um, Now you can kind of have the best of both worlds. You can make sense of, you can have predicates range over all the possible worlds, which is what you need if you want to be able to make sensible statements. But uh, we don't have to have contradictions where I have both have and don't have the same property at the same time. And then we can also make sense of essential and accidental properties. An essential property is something that I must have to be me. And it can be true of other objects too, right? So think that trees are essentially made of wood or something, or that music is essentially pleasant or something, which is probably not true, but right, whatever you think, what you're saying is that every possible world, if something counts as music or a tree or me, right, it'll be pleasant or made of wood or a human, right? And there's no possible world where something is a tree but isn't made of wood, right? That's an essential property. A property a thing must have to be what it is, right? And accidental properties are properties that you could gain or lose without changing the sort of thing that you are, right? So if my hair is accidentally blonde, then sure, some of my counterparts might not have blonde hair, right? But if I'm essentially human, none of my counterparts will be dogs. Okay, so far so good. Now we do want to make sure that Lewis's account sort of makes true every modal claim that we intuitively take to be true, right? That's sort of the test of this is like our intuition says, yeah, if the short hadn't happened, then the fire wouldn't have happened. That's true, and Lewis's job is to make that true, right, with a system. So if we think that my hair being blonde is an accidental property, well, how do we know that that's made true, right? How do we know there's a possible world where my hair is not blonde? And Lewis takes care of that by just claiming there's a possible world for every possible combination of facts, platitude. They're all out there. So there's a possible world, right, where my hair is blonde. There's a possible world where my hair is black. There's a possible world where my hair is red, blue, and so on, right? There's a possible world where I'm the president. There's a possible world where I'm a philosopher, and so on, right? Uh, and everything about every fact. Doesn't have to be just about me, right? There's a possible world where the capital of the United States is painted green and white, and so on. So every way a world could be is a way that some world is. Okay, so that's the theory. You may have questions about it. You know, there, you can work your whole career on Lewis's account of possible worlds if you felt like it. But that's the basic idea. It does have some problems. The biggest problem is it's really weird, right? And Lewis himself like notes this. Because look, when he tells people his theory, right, which is that oh no, possible worlds exist. Uh, they're no more or less existy than our world, right? Um, Says no one accepts it. It sounds crazy to them, and they don't necessarily say what's wrong with this theory. Usually, he just gets what he calls an incredulous stare. Right? He says, "Okay, well, I get that this is hard for you, but your incredulous stare is not an argument, right? So just the fact that it seems crazy, he thinks, is not uh, an argument, so it doesn't refute it, right? So give me an argument, right? A more substantive problem you could call irrelevance. So again, modal realism is supposed to give us truth makers for our modal claims, right? So if I say I could have married Agatha, um, it's supposed to make that true. But the way he makes that true is saying, oh, there's a counterpart of you that married Agatha, right? In a world spatiotemporally isolated from you. Um, and is that really what I'm trying to say, right, with my counterfactuals? Or I'm trying to say that, no, me, in this world, I could have married Agatha in this world, right? If I had just, a year ago done some different things, right? And who cares who that other guy, my counterpart, married, right? Sure, he looked a lot like me, but I don't know him, right? I will never meet him. None of his experiences are my experiences. So what does that have to do with me, right? So it seems like maybe these counterparts are sort of actually irrelevant to the truth of the but at any rate, he's not wrong that it gives us something that exists that we can point to as the truth maker for our modal claims, even if intuitively doesn't feel like maybe there might feel like an irrelevant truth maker, but at least it's something, right? Okay, so is this our only option, concretism? Well, no. So, um, we've talked a lot about abstract objects. Maybe some of you have been convinced by Quine or Dretske that we should accept that they exist. And if you do, then there's another approach to this possible world semantics, which is that possible worlds are abstract objects, right? Sets of propositions or something like that. There's different ways to cash it out, right? Propositions, objects. So again, abstract objects do exist, right? They don't exist like physical things do, but for people who believe in it, they exist. They're just in a, you know, again, spatiotemporally, non-spatiotemporal world, right? So along with the number three, there's the possible worlds too. Um, so if you already are committed to abstract objects, then why not say possible worlds are abstract objects? You've got something that exists that makes your counterfactual claim. There's an abstract world where the electrical short didn't happen and the fire didn't happen. So I don't know, does that get rid of the incredulous stare problem? I mean, for some people, believing in abstract objects is not much less weird than possible worlds. But if you think it is, or if you're already committed to them for other reasons, then sure, why not? So what kind of abstract object is a possible world? Well, a popular way to cash it out is it's a set of propositions that describes the total state of affairs, and propositions are abstract objects, right? So it is a maximally detailed world that contains every detail that is consistent with the other details, right? So that means there's no possible world where my hair is like both blonde and black all over, right? Because that's contradictory. There's no possible worlds with square circles and stuff like that. But every possible world will say something about my hair color, right? Every possible fact will be there, and a possible world is a consistent set of every. So on the abstract object account of possible worlds, our world does have a special status, right? So our world is the only one that's like exist physically, right? The others are only exist abstractly, right? Which is still a kind of existence, right? But there's something different about them. And it means you don't have to use Lewis's counterpart theory. So I can say, when I say I could have married Agatha, I'm talking about myself, not a counterpart of myself. What I'm saying is there's a coherent set of propositions in which I marry Agatha. So maybe you find this easier to swallow than Lewis. It's not without its problems, even beyond the fact that you have to believe in abstract objects. So first of all, Lewis's concretism is a reductive account of modal claims. So um, he defines necessity and possibility in terms of sets of possible worlds, right? If you like reduction, right, you like things to be defined in terms of other things, then uh, good for Lewis on that one. Abstractionism kind of makes possibility and necessity basic. There's no further reduction, right? Um, so if you like everything to be reduced to something else, then maybe Lewis is for you. But not everything is going to be reduced, right? Explanation stops somewhere. So the abstractionist could just insist that explanation stops at necessity and possibility, and there's no sort of further cashing that out in terms of anything else. A more serious problem, which is if the possible worlds are understood as sets of something, propositions, sets of state of affairs, which often uh, people who've worked out abstractionist accounts of possible worlds do conceive the possible world of sets. You can construct a paradox that violates the theorems of set theory, right? It's a little bit technical. Here's the general idea of it. So I don't know if you know what a power set is, right? But a power set is sort of all the elements of the set. So For example, look down here. I'll skip ahead and then come back. So you've got a set contains the numbers 1 and 2. The power set of that set is a set containing the empty set, the set containing the number 1, the set containing the number 2, and the set containing the set 1, 2, right? That's what a power set is. Cantor proved that the cardinality of the power set of all the elements of a possible world, or of any set, should be greater than the cardinality of the original set. By cardinality, we just mean number of members. Again, the set containing 1 and 2, the cardinality is 2, right? The power set has a cardinality of 1, 2, 3, 4, right? Because it's got 4 elements in the set. So that's the way it should be, right? The power set should have more items in it than the original set. But the problem is for each element of the power set of a possible world, there is a true proposition that that element is a set. So that proposition is also an element of the possible world, and so the cardinality of the possible world is equal to or greater than that of the power set. Every time you make the power set, because these possible worlds are determined, they say it's every true proposition. Well, now you've got a new true proposition, right? That this element is in the set, right? And that adds another element to the set, and then that makes it goes on forever, right? So you don't end up with having more elements, basically. So that's bad. Okay, if you didn't understand that, hey, it's the last in this whole course. Thanks for sticking out with me. I hope, again, I don't expect you to love or even understand everything that we talked about in this course, but I hope that you found something that you were interested in and focused in on it. It seemed to me in the drafts of your essays, you were doing exactly that, and nearly all of them came up with some original argumentation, which is doing philosophy. So now, before the end of the class, you should have gotten your notes. You can just sort of refine it, right? Fix it up. And for the vast majority of you, you're over the hump. The hard part is done, right? Congratulations, and I will see you on Monday.